Today's guest on the winning teams is Greg Spira. Greg is the author of Trust the Plan, Demand Management for Business Leaders. He's been in the business of helping organizations to plan, to roll out projects and deliver projects for many, many years. And he's worked with some of the biggest and best organizations throughout the world. Fascinating interview in terms of the things that he learned from, what separates the organizations that are good at planning and executing and those that aren't. And you might be surprised that the answer is not kind of maybe exactly what you think. But we do also talk about how you build an atmosphere of trust in an organization and the things that the behaviors you're looking for in order to ensure that that trust is maintained and built upon, because it is fundamental to that. We also spent quite a bit of time talking about, like for many projects, they are made up of not a discrete team, but in fact of a cross-functional teams. And how do you manage the being in members of cross-functional teams, but also how do you manage the leaders of the people who are within that cross-functional team to make sure that there is alignment on what is being achieved. And we also dig into being really clear about what are the objectives and what success looks like when we're delivering projects. So Greg is a real expert in his space, has written a very interesting book and a great kind of how-to book for leaders if you're looking at managing a planning process and also managing change in an organization. So I really encourage you to sit back and listen to the very entertaining Greg Spira. Greg, thank you so much indeed for joining us here on the Winning Teams podcast. It's a great honor to have you.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
We're looking forward to this. You're the author of Trust the Book, the Trust the Plan, the Demand Management for Business Leaders, which is, you'll explain this better, but a lot of it is around planning. Just curious before you get into the detail of it and what's in your book and that and the details of it, but in terms of the success rate for the execution of plans, I've kind of heard a figure, but I'm not quite sure. You might have a more accurate figure of what the success rate is, or failure rate, depending way you look at it.
Well, you could measure the success or failure of plans themselves, and I'm sure you've got stats that say they're not highly, plans typically fail. But I think what's more important than the plan itself is the act of planning and the act of getting a team together to create the plan. And there's the classic Eisenhower quote that's like, in preparing for battle or preparing for war, plans are nothing, but planning is indispensable. It's the fact that you're able to react to when things go sideways, right? The other classic quote that, like, plans are great up until the first shot is fired in battle. Like, you hear these things. So people say, well, why bother planning? Well, it's not about trying to get the perfect plan. It's about knowing how to react to things when things change. So,
but that all comes back. Yeah, but that all comes back to. But I mean, the failure rate is quite high, or the success rate is quite low. I think that would be generally accepted, depending which way you want to look at it. But interesting what you said there is it's the act of planning, which is really important, and that's the whole piece about mobilizing, getting the team together. It's not about the document, right? It's about getting the team together. Why is it that that's just missed so often? I mean, it's not exactly rocket science, but it is frequently missed. We're dying to get the project plan on a paper and get going.
Well, there's a difference between something can be simple and something can be easy. So sometimes simple things are very, very hard. And I think in my observations, it's a lot of the people aspect of it, the behavioral aspects of it, the incentive models. And, in large organizations, executive suites are filled with people who are trying to vie for growth and leadership and take the credit in some cases for success. And sometimes I've even witnessed it and observed it and worked in organizations where leaders actually actively believe in creating internal competition in order to try to breed the best ideas. And they miss the point that the companies that succeed, the ones that hit their plans most often are the ones that work as a team, which means you have to think about things like sacrifice and being vulnerable and being willing to, take one for the team, as it were, as people sometimes say. So those types of characteristics, I don't think they're as well rewarded by executives, and there's a learning and an understanding. And quite frankly, it's just harder. It's just harder to work. It's easier for me to define my own little sandbox that I'm going to operate in, that I have full autonomy and full self-sufficiency over, because then I don't have to deal with my peers and my neighbors, right? It's harder to have to give up some of that autonomy and self-sufficiency, and be vulnerable and work with the team. But individually, it's harder, but as collectively, it's a lot better. And so this is where the book comes from, is identifying what can we do, what things can a leader take away and do on their own in order to try to live into those principles.
Yeah. I mean, in the book, you say that what separates companies with a good track record of execution from poor ones is trust. Now, I would believe that, and I would agree with that. I'm just curious, do you have evidence to back that statement up?
Tons of evidence.
Yeah.
And so in my day-to-day life, I help large organizations with their planning processes, and I get to sit in our approach is not to just, here's a blueprint, go do it. We actually sit shoulder to shoulder with companies. I'll sit in the planning meetings, work with them, and observe it. And so I observe it all day long, right? And I observe the transition and the transformation. And I've lived it in my own, when I was in industry for 10, 15 years doing it on my own, is that when you have leaders that don't trust each other, and everyone can kind of think of or come up with examples of the supply chain leader that didn't trust the salesperson, or the finance person that didn't trust the marketing person, that they always had this bristling kind of relationship. It leads to second guessing, undermining, overriding, the comments in the hallway saying, oh, that guy's a sandbagger. This is the real number, or the meeting after the meeting where you go and you rethink what's going to happen. And that's a lot of energy that's invested in well, invested is the wrong word, wasted in an organization working against itself. When I've observed that the organizations that tend to achieve their goals take all that energy and focus it on the market that they're competing in, right? Trying to come up with better products, better plans, respond to competition, deal with a pandemic, deal with all those things that are happening. So I've observed both sides of it, and it's just the amount of energy that's wasted when it's a low trust organization.
So when you actually see a situation where there is high level of trust and it is working really well, what's the behavior that you're seeing, that you're observing, that you don't see in the opposite?
So there's behaviors, there's a handful of them, right? So there's the impersonal behaviors, and I can say things like having an emotional intelligence, caring about your peers, having a connection with them, being credible, like giving credible information, being disciplined, following, saying the say-do ratio, right? I do what I say and I say what I do. I tell you, hey, I'm going to be there on Tuesday, and I'm there on Tuesday. I'm going to deliver this order tomorrow, and I deliver the order tomorrow. There's a more technical definition of some of that, which is that we remain unbiased. We ensure that we don't promise more or less than we are going to go and deliver. Even in uncertainty, even if I'm a sales guy out there trying to predict what am I going to sell next quarter or next year, I don't know for certain, but I can create a pattern of behavior of either being high or low. If I oscillate between over and under delivering, then I don't have a bias. But if I stay on one side of the fence all the time, people will second guess me. So it's those creating trustworthy plans. I think on top of that, the other example I frequently cite is just explaining what you're going to go and do, right? I use the example, you walk into a bank and ask for a loan. Say, I want to borrow $100,000 to start my lemonade stand. The first thing, the bank's not going to trust or not trust you based on what you said or who you are. They're going to trust you based on the business plan you provide. Right. So if I'm in an organization and I'm a sales guy and I say I'm going to go sell $100,000 worth of product next month, well, just tell me a little bit of what you're planning to do. Like, explain to me, is it with which customers? How are you going to go and do that? And if the answer is, well, that's none of your business, get out of my shorts, people aren't going to trust me. But if it's like, oh, here's the 3 things I'm going to go and do, I'm happy to explain it to you, automatic trust goes much higher, right? So those types of behaviors and characteristics are what we're after.
Yeah. when you're looking at, when you're looking at organizations, and very often when there's a project, they're kind of, it's cross-functional. It's not just, within a clearly defined team. How do you, what are the things you need to do from the very start to start creating that atmosphere of trust, so that you kind of put in some foundation and then you build upon that? Because that seems like it's a fundamentally important thing to do, but
Mhm.
perhaps we don't always give an awful lot of time to actually doing it.
So our organization, I'm a big believer in education and teach the people why it makes sense. And then human beings are logical in most respects, and we'll follow that. So I'm a big proponent of educating people up front, right? So if they're about to embark on something, and when we're implementing large processes like integrated business planning or a big demand planning process or a supply planning or some sort of a process, first thing we do is educate and include not just the process, not just like, hey, here's what you do, step A, step B, step C. It's, here are the behaviors and here's how you need to work together as a team. We include that. We double down on that all the way up to the top, all the way up to make sure the CEO of the company knows these trustworthy behaviors are what you need to reinforce. And then from there can be some work to do. I said earlier about creating codependence and interdependence, and that you want people to have to work together instead of people being autonomous and self-sufficient. Sometimes it's a matter of taking away resources. I've come into organizations where everybody's got their own view of what the sales forecast is. So I start saying, well, then I got to take away your ability to, like, if everyone has their own forecasting team, we only need one. So we got to start taking some away. And so when you're going into a project and people need to work together, you have to sort of look at it and say, what's going to drive people to have to collaborate and cooperate and work together? And what are the things that might give them the out, give them the ability to avoid collaboration? And how do I remove those things?
Yeah. Wait, going back to the point about the cross-functional teams, one of the things that I've observed is that, you get a group of people that they're from different functions. You probably have somebody who's kind of heading up the project, or you're likely to somebody who's heading up the project. But you need these people to work cross-functionally really, really well. The problem can be is that all of these people have other bosses somewhere else in the organization, where,
Absolutely.
who have got different priorities, and just because this individual who may work for me sitting in your project, but I'm saying, hey, I need, right? How do you get that balance, and how do you negotiate that with the individual in the project, with their leaders, and make sure that you're not having the individual with kind of whose good direct reporting line is kind of saying, hey, listen, I don't want you spending so much time in this project.
So I put in the book, grassroots efforts to try to create cross-functional collaboration are very challenged because of exactly what you said. Because if the leaders don't trust each other,
Yeah.
then it will be very difficult. It can be done, but
Yeah.
you're always kind of operating in a covert manner. You're like,
Yeah.
meeting with somebody because you believe in it, but your boss would be annoyed with it. And I've observed this, right? I've had bosses and observed leaders direct their teams not to share information with other teams because they were surprised or caught off guard, or some piece of information went through. I went into one organization where the salesperson said, I'm not allowed to tell the demand planner anything. Well,
Right.
why is that? Well, because when I tell him something, he goes to his boss and they go to their boss, and then it surprises my boss in front of the CEO, and then it's an all-out bun fight, and then I get in trouble for it. So I just said, so their answer is shut her down. Don't communicate anything to anybody unless the leader has approved it. And so I genuinely do think you have to start at the top. This is why the book is for business leaders. It's for the
Yeah.
why should a CEO care? What behaviors are they not understanding are happening? If they feel comfortable that their sales, marketing, supply chain, and finance people are kind of very combative, sometimes I think CEOs think that can be productive in some way. Like have the horses race. It doesn't work in my experience, and so it creates then a more fragmented, more siloed organization below. And so I turned to the CEO of the organization and say, and I've literally did this just the other day, and said, it's your job to reward trustworthy behavior. not necessarily to reward. Performance is important, but sometimes one function's performance will suffer because they're doing something for the greater good, or they're choosing to trust somebody else. If the sales guy trusts the supply guy to make the product, and the product doesn't get made, and the sales guy doesn't hit his number or her number as a result of it not being available, who do you beat up?
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're coming down on the sales guy because they didn't meet their number, and but they trusted their behavior was to trust their teammates, you're creating the wrong incentive model in the organization. And so that education has to happen all the way at the top. And then, but when a leadership team is highly functional and highly trusting, my goodness, the amount of integration that happens naturally underneath is astounding. That's where you see the organizations just excel, because these partnerships and teamwork at the lower levels of the organization can be empowered without them having to work around or dance or deal with the fact that they know that their bosses don't agree with each other.
Yeah, I'm just curious about this, the one piece, and I just reminded when you were talking about it, I was doing some work with a group there not too long ago, and again, it was very much a cross-functional team, and the way the organization do it is that they just put everybody in the group, but there's no actual attempt to make it into a team, which I think is a gap, right, for starters. But the other interesting thing was that when we started the conversation about, well, who are your stakeholders, right, for this particular project? Who are your stakeholders? And initially they came up with the list, and then when you started to poke at it, you realized, oh no, actually there were a lot more stakeholders that they needed to manage, right? And that stakeholder management can often be a very discrete part of a project in its own right, that you need to do in a large organization. And I'm just curious, is that something that you've seen that gets missed a lot?
It does. We often get called in to come and kind of deal with the missed aspects of change management, right? Very often I see processes, the process is a solution, and it should, if we're as detailed as we need to be in the process design, then we should have no issue with adoption or change, because we've been very prescriptive and people will follow the process. And I remind people that, if I want to, when unions are having a spat with a company and they want to do the most, they want to do some damage, they want to like really bring the people to the negotiating table, they institute work to rule, which means they tell their union members to only follow the process, only to the letter, which will grind an organization to a halt. People realize that a lot of what makes an organization successful is the stuff that's not well defined from a process perspective, that's relying on people doing what they believe is right. And that's precisely the thing. People don't second guess or override or do all of this stuff because they're bad people. They do it because they genuinely believe it's in the best interest of the organization. And so when you throw a cross-functional team together, as you said, and say, go work on a project, and you don't identify all the different stakeholders and where they are, there can be a lot of people that will just outright resist the project or cause it to fail, not because they're sitting there saying, I'm going to cause this project to fail, and that's what I love doing. It's because they believe something's been missed, or they believe it's for the best interest of the organization to do what they're doing. And so that whole exercise of listening to all the different perspectives and bringing them along is just required.
Yeah,
or the organizations of people.
Yeah, or the stakeholders don't actually understand what their role is and what the expectation is. Very often that is not explicit either. I want to go on and talk about, because this is kind of a pet subject of mine, and you talk about it in the book, where we very often confuse the process with the outcome, right? And when you hear talking about, we talk about goals, but they actually write the process or the action rather than the goal, which is why I'm kind of a fan of OKRs and the objectives and key results, because it kind of splits that out. But how do we ensure that people don't do that? Because that causes a lot of confusion, and we are not explicit about the outcome and the result we're looking for.
So one of the first things I'll do with an organization is sit down in a room and say, okay, we're going to define the language we're going to use here. And it's like a language exercise. And then I'll surprise them, because I'll say, okay, what do you want to, what is our target? What's our goal or our plan? Or I just list a bunch of words, because everybody in the room will have a different word for what they believe a target is, or stated objective defined in a measurable outcome, like an OKR, right? I want to grow
Yeah.
10% next year. But people will call it the plan, they'll call it the target, they'll call it the budget, they'll call it the commitment. There's a thesaurus of 100 names or words and within the organization. And I say, the problem is if you all have different words for that, then what do you call your current truth as you know it? Because you have to have a view, just like you get into your car and you program your Google Maps or your Waze or whatever it is, your GPS to get to a destination. The destination is where you want to get to, but there might be traffic, an accident, you might have to take a detour, you might get a flat tire. You need to know about those things in order to be able to navigate the route.
Yeah.
You always need to have a where am I today and where am I trying to get to? And if you're not clear on what the language is and how you express those two things in your organization, you can't help you. Like we have to start with that. And so that's where that sort of precipitates in the book, this concept of this confusion, because there's many leaders I've encountered that they're like, I don't want to hear you tell me that you're unlikely to deliver the goal I've given you for the year. But that's a very old school, like, I think the world is too dynamic, especially in a post-pandemic world, to think that you can just set a target at the start of the year and then require no realignment across the entire organization. Every function can just do exactly what they said they would do on day 1 of the year, and then on day 365 be exactly where you expect to get to. It just does not exist in any organizations that I'm aware of. Possibly 50 years ago when I wasn't around doing this stuff, maybe that's the way it was, right? In the good old days of like simpler times. I don't know. I know today that that's unlikely. So you have to have a way of knowing where you are and knowing how you need to close the gaps. And that means we need to clarify that language.
Yeah. But to go back to that, just to build on that, it's sometimes when you're actually asking people to be really specific about the goals, they actually struggle to get there, to be really specific about it. And it always fascinates me why we find it so difficult to be very specific. And I'm wondering, is it because we're kind of cautious about not nailing it? Because then if it's a bit gray, well, then, nobody's quite sure. Or is it we just simply don't understand what it is we're trying to achieve?
I've seen for years and years and years, I've heard the concept of SMART goals and objectives and being able to specific, measurable, time bound, all that sort of stuff. And yet, even when I would run teams, people have to practice that. I would go in and say, tell me what you're going to get done at the end of this month. And they'd give me a list of things. And I get to the end of the month and say, can you measurably identify that you actually accomplished any of these things? And they'd realize that, like, they'd define their goal for the month was to work on something. Yeah. Work on this project. It's like, well, did you work on it? Well, I worked. Well, that's not really a good definition of a goal or an achievement. It needs to be the outcome, right? And so I do think that there's it might seem simple, but it's harder than it seems. You have to really think about it. How do you make something measurable? And I think there is an element to your point. We use the term, don't confuse effort with results. People are really proud of putting in a lot of effort. Yeah. But you can put a lot of effort. But I worked so hard this year, I should get my gold star. But if your effort didn't deliver results, the reality in business is people get paid on results, not on
absolutely,
and not the other. So
yeah, Greg, I'm curious what you talk about, because it's something that I come across quite a bit. Is when a project comes to the end of a cycle, and you talk about it in the book, the process of reviewing and actually really having a good review, not about beating ourselves up or kind of, flagellating ourselves because of things that went wrong. But in terms of learning, we don't do that enough. Sure, we don't.
Well, and it's because it's very difficult to do it productively if we don't do it, the upfront work well. If you don't define, remember I said, if I went into the bank and said, I need $100,000 loan, and they said, sure, here's a $100,000 loan. And then 6 months later, they're like, where's my money back? And I'm like, money's gone. Well, there's nothing to have a conversation about, because they don't know, did I do what I said I would do? Oh, I didn't tell you what I was going to do. I didn't provide any details. There was no detail behind the scenes to be able to hold anybody accountable to success or failure or anything to learn from. There's nothing to learn from. Whereas if we go in beforehand and are clearly documenting, these are the things we're going to go and do.
Yeah.
Sales, you're going to do these things. Marketing, we're going to do an ad campaign. Supply chain's going to go and build this new product, and product management's going to start investing in and understanding this new space. If we document all of that and we do the things we say we're going to do, when things don't work out, we can go back and learn from it. But if we all just sort of sit in our own silos and commit to numbers, right? Oh, the plan is $100 million in growth. No detail behind it, no plans. Right. And when I mean plan, I don't mean a number, I mean all the words.
Yeah.
If none of the underlying information is there, then the review and the postmortem, or whatever you want to call it, or the looking back and learning from it is so difficult. And that's where people get driven crazy, right? They're in these, they spend 3 or 4 days trying to dissect and figure out afterwards what they thought they were supposed to be doing, only to then be able to say what they actually did or didn't do. And by then you've wasted now another, a whole bunch of time that you could have been spent focusing on the future.
That's true. Greg, the work you're doing is really important. I mean, that's kind of stating the obvious, and obviously the timing of your work is really good, because businesses are in such a time of flux and change. And as you said, it's a dynamic, every industry that I can think of is working in a very dynamic market, so that the organizations need to change. So the work you're doing, and I think the book is a really great, it's a great book, but it's also a great kind of manual for people to have to actually go through that. But listen, before we wrap up, can I just ask you 2 questions to ask everybody? One is a book other than your own that has had an impact upon you. What's the book and what was the impact?
So I'd say if it in this space around trust, there's a great book called The Trusted Advisor. And it's I mean, there's lots of books on trust out there, but it's focused on actually like service providers, people like in my position, of how to be a trusted advisor to a client. But we found that it really applies internally within organizations, of being a trusted advisor within an organization. Right. And so there's characteristics of being reliable and disciplined and things like that. They're well outlined in that book. So Trusted Advisor, fantastic book. I'll add one other on top of it. There's Crucial Conversations, or Crucial Accountability. So you've heard of those books. Yes, they're a great complement to it, because if you're like how do I have these interpersonal discussions, those 2 are amazing. And then I think the second piece was around a ritual.
Daily rituals, if you have them, and how they serve you.
So one that I try to stick to is getting up and exercising first thing in the morning. I think it's a great way to get my brain kicked off. And it's a great, I find running on the treadmill is a way to process. I'll sit there and have the conversation with myself and think through what I need to do for the day. So that doesn't mean I'm as 100% disciplined as I should be, but I aspire to do that pretty much every day.
Well, that's great. Greg, thanks so much. How can people reach you? We'll put everything in the notes, but if people listening now, how can they reach out and get in touch with you and get the book?
Sure. So the book is on Amazon. The book is also available on the Oliver White website. My website, gregspira.ca, GREGSPIRA.ca, has links to my email address, my phone number, a click to buy the book on Amazon. And additionally, there's white papers and other blog posts that I have out there for people to take a look at if they would like some additional information and reading. So it's there on the website. You can also look me up on LinkedIn. I post a lot on LinkedIn. Respond very actively there as well.
Super. Greg, thank you so much. It's been really interesting. Look forward to doing it again.
Likewise. Thanks, John.